My name is Claire Bennett, and I want to tell you about the day I sat in a courtroom and listened to my own husband's family call me nothing. Not directly. Nobody says it that plainly in a courtroom. They say it in soft, polite voices, wrapped in legal language, delivered with sad little smiles that are supposed to look like sympathy. But I heard exactly what they meant. Mrs. Bennett doesn't have what you'd call a traditional career, the lawyer said, glancing at his notes like he was reading off a grocery list. She left corporate law 11 years ago. Since then, she's done freelance writing, some consulting, unpaid, for a few nonprofits, no steady income, no title, no position. He said it slowly, letting every word land, like he was placing stones on a scale, waiting for the room to feel the weight of it. Across the courtroom, my mother-in-law, Eleanor Whitfield, nodded along, dabbing at the corner of her eye with a tissue she didn't need. My husband, soon-to-be ex-husband, Daniel, sat beside his family's lawyer, staring straight ahead, refusing to look at me. Refusing to look at his own daughter, Emma, who sat outside in the hallway with my sister, waiting to hear if her mother would still be allowed to raise her. I want you to understand something before I go further. This wasn't just a divorce. This was a family with more money than most small countries trying to convince a judge that I was unfit. Not because I had ever hurt my daughter, not because I had ever failed her, but because I didn't have a job title they respected. Eleanor's lawyer, a tall, silver-haired man named Gerald Voss, continued without pause. Your Honor, we're not questioning Mrs. Bennett's love for her daughter. We're questioning her stability. A woman with no consistent income, no career trajectory, living off, forgive me, off an allowance from a marriage that is now ending. That is not the environment the Whitfield family believes is best for a child with this family's name attached to her future. This family's name. As if Emma wasn't also my daughter. As if I hadn't carried her, raised her, sat up with her through fevers at 3 a.m, while Daniel was at business dinners with people whose names I'd stopped bothering to remember. I sat there in a plain gray blazer I'd owned for 6 years, my hands folded quietly in my lap, and I said nothing. Not because I had nothing to say, because I knew something none of them knew. Something I had built quietly, patiently, for over a decade, without a single person in that family ever suspecting it existed. They thought my career was empty. They had no idea what I actually owned. And in less than 2 hours, a judge was going to stand up in that courtroom and change everything they thought they understood about me, and about themselves. But to understand how we arrived at that moment, you need to go back. Back to before the courtroom. Back to before the affair. Back to the beginning of a marriage that looked perfect from the outside and had been quietly falling apart on the inside for years. 11 years earlier, I was a junior associate at one of the top corporate law firms in the city. 60-hour weeks. Billable hours tracked to the minute. I was good at it. Sharp, fast, the kind of lawyer senior partners fought over for their deal teams. I had a future there. Everyone told me so, and for a while I believed them. I met Daniel Bennett at a fundraising gala his family hosted every spring. The Whitfields owned Whitfield Industries, a manufacturing empire that had been in the family for 3 generations. Steel first, then plastics, then advanced components for the auto industry. Old money, older pride. Daniel was handsome, easy to talk to, confident in the specific way that only comes from never once worrying about rent. For a while, I believed that confidence meant something more than it did. We married 2 years later. Emma came the year after that. Here is the part nobody in that courtroom knew, because I never told them. 6 months before I gave birth to Emma, Whitfield Industries nearly collapsed. It wasn't public. The family kept it buried, hired the right people to keep it out of the papers, out of the trade journals, out of every place a competitor or a journalist might have looked. But I was married into that family, and I paid attention. A failed overseas expansion into a market that never opened the way their consultants promised. A factory fire that wasn't fully insured because someone had let the policy lapse during a cost-cutting review 2 years earlier. A supplier contract that fell apart mid-production. It all hit within the same 18 months, one disaster stacking on top of the last before the family had time to recover from the one before it. The company's holding structure, a private entity called Whitfield Holdings LLC, was drowning in debt. Shares that had been worth a fortune only a few years earlier were suddenly worth almost nothing, and the family was quietly trying to find someone, anyone, willing to buy in and rescue them without asking too many questions about why the numbers looked the way they did. I was a corporate lawyer. I understood distressed assets. I had spent years reviewing exactly this kind of collapse from the outside, advising other clients on exactly these kinds of deals. And I understood something else, something that mattered more than the panic in the room every time the family gathered to discuss it. I understood what those shares would be worth again once the company recovered, if it recovered, and if the right people were patient enough to hold on through the worst of it. So I did something I never told Daniel. I never told Eleanor. I never told anyone in that family, not even years later, not even when things between Daniel and me were still good. Using a small inheritance left to me by my grandmother, combined with savings I had built quietly from my legal career, I created a separate holding company, a small, anonymous entity with a name that meant absolutely nothing to anyone who might come across it. Ashgrove Capital Partners. And through Ashgrove, over the following 2 years, I bought up distressed shares of Whitfield Holdings LLC. Slowly, carefully, through intermediaries who never once connected the purchases to my name. Piece by piece, quarter by quarter, while everyone around me assumed I was simply a young wife adjusting to married life. Why would I do that? Because I saw something the family, in the middle of their panic, could not see clearly. I saw a company with good bones and bad management, run by people who had inherited their positions rather than earned them. I saw a business that could recover completely if someone patient enough held on and waited through the years it would take to rebuild trust with suppliers, customers, and lenders. I was right. 3 years after I quietly finished buying, Whitfield Industries stabilized. 5 years after that, it was thriving again. New contracts, new leadership eventually brought in by the board, once the old guard finally admitted they needed outside help. A turnaround story that business journals loved writing about, without ever once asking who had been patient enough and had enough capital to make that turnaround financially possible in the first place. Nobody ever asked who owned the largest single block of shares in the holding company that controlled it all. Ashgrove Capital Partners stayed exactly where I wanted it, invisible. I never told Daniel because, honestly, in the early years, I wasn't certain I trusted him with something that important. And the longer the marriage went on, the more that early instinct proved itself correct, piece by painful piece. I left my law firm 2 years after Emma was born. Everyone assumed it was because Daniel's family wanted a wife who stayed home, who hosted dinners, who didn't outshine their son in front of his own colleagues. Partly that assumption was true. Eleanor made her preferences known often enough. But mostly, I left because managing Ashgrove quietly, from behind the scenes, took real time and real attention, and I could not do that careful, patient work while also billing 60 hours a week defending someone else's company in court. So to the outside world, I became Claire, who does some writing. Claire, who consults for nonprofits, informally, for free. Claire, who left her real career behind to raise a child and plan dinner parties. I let them believe it. It was safer that way. And for a long time, it genuinely didn't matter what they believed, because our marriage still seemed fine on the surface. Then it stopped being fine, and everything I had built quietly for years suddenly mattered more than I ever expected it would. I think it's worth pausing here to explain, in simple terms, exactly what I built during those quiet years, because the mechanics of it matter to understanding just how completely the Whitfield family failed to see what was happening under their own roof. Ashgrove Capital Partners was never a large, flashy operation. It had no offices, no employees beyond a small compliance team I hired specifically to keep everything filed correctly and legally. It existed, for most of its life, as little more than a legal structure and a brokerage account, managed carefully through intermediaries who bought and held shares on Ashgrove's behalf without ever revealing whose interests they ultimately served. When Whitfield Holdings LLC nearly collapsed, its shares were sold in small blocks, often through distressed asset brokers who specialized in exactly this kind of situation. Companies in trouble, insiders looking to offload risk quietly before word spread further, outside investors hoping to buy in low and wait for a recovery that might never come. Most buyers in that world are institutional: pension funds, private equity groups, family offices with teams of analysts. Almost none of them are individual women in their late 20s, quietly reviewing distressed manufacturing debt during their lunch breaks at a law firm. That was exactly why nobody looked twice at Ashgrove's purchases. A pension fund buying in raises questions. A private individual, working through a small, obscure holding company with no public profile, buying modest blocks over an extended period, raises almost none. I was, in the language brokers use, a quiet participant. The kind of buyer nobody remembers afterward, because nothing about the purchase looked unusual enough to remember. Over time, as the company recovered, Ashgrove's holdings simply grew in value without requiring me to do very much active management at all. I reviewed quarterly reports. I occasionally voted on shareholder matters, always through the same intermediary structure, always without attaching my name publicly to any of it. It was patient, unglamorous work, closer to gardening than to the dramatic version of investing people imagine from movies. You plant something, you wait, you trust the process, even when nothing visible seems to be happening for months at a time. Eleanor once asked me, years into the marriage, what exactly I did all day while Daniel was at the office. I remember telling her honestly, I write. I read a lot of financial reports, actually, just for my own interest. She had laughed, gently, the way you laugh at a hobby you don't take seriously. That's sweet, dear, she'd said. Everyone needs something to occupy their time. She had no idea that the reports I was reading determined, in part, whether her son's family business would survive another difficult quarter. The first sign was small enough that I almost let it pass. Daniel started traveling more for business, though he'd never needed to travel that often before, not in 9 years of marriage. Then came the late nights that didn't quite match the calendar he kept on the kitchen counter. Then came the moment, almost by accident, when I found a message on his phone that he had forgotten to delete, from a woman named Vanessa, 29 years old, from his firm's marketing department, with a way of writing his name that told me everything I needed to know in a single sentence. I confronted him that night, after Emma had gone to sleep, in the quiet of our kitchen where so many ordinary conversations had happened over the years. He didn't deny it. He didn't apologize either. He simply said, in the calm, dismissive tone I had grown to recognize more and more over the last few years, "You knew what this family expected, Claire. I need someone who understands my world." My world. As if I hadn't spent a decade quietly holding up a piece of that world he never even knew existed. As if the very ground his family's fortune stood on hadn't been rebuilt, in part, by money I had risked on their behalf, without ever asking for a single thank you. I filed for divorce 3 weeks later, after the shock had settled into something colder and more decided. That's when things turned genuinely ugly. Eleanor, who had tolerated me for years as acceptable, if not ideal, her words, said to a friend at a dinner party, repeated back to me later by someone who thought I should know, suddenly became my open enemy. She hired the family's most aggressive attorney, Gerald Voss, known across the city for one specialty above all others: making absolutely certain that Whitfield money never left Whitfield hands, no matter the human cost of achieving that outcome. Their strategy became clear almost immediately. They weren't only fighting over property, or even simply fighting for control of the divorce settlement. They were fighting for custody of Emma, using the argument that I was financially unstable, professionally aimless, and fundamentally unsuited to raise a child who, in Eleanor's own words, spoken coldly at one particularly tense family dinner before the paperwork was even filed, carries this family's legacy, whether she chooses to or not. I remember sitting at that dinner table, watching Eleanor say those words about my own daughter, feeling something harden quietly in my chest, and thinking, you have no idea what I could say right now. You have no idea what I actually hold in my hands, and what it would mean for you if I chose to say it out loud tonight. at this table, in front of everyone. But I said nothing. Because revealing Ashgrove too early, in anger, at a dinner table surrounded by family friends and half-finished wine glasses, would have been a mistake I could never take back. I needed the truth to come out in a place where it would carry real weight, where it would be undeniable, verified, official, and where it would protect Emma first, rather than simply satisfying my own anger in the moment. I needed it to come out in court, in front of a judge, with documents that no lawyer, however aggressive, could argue away. Over the following months, Gerald Voss built what he clearly believed was an airtight case against me. He hired a private investigator to document my lifestyle, as his filings politely called it. He requested financial records going back years, expecting to find gaps, inconsistencies, evidence that I was living beyond whatever modest means they had already assumed I possessed. Ironically, this was the first real risk to my secret. Investigators pulling detailed financial records can sometimes trace unusual patterns, transfers between accounts, intermediary structures, anything that looks even slightly out of place to a trained eye. I had built Ashgrove carefully, specifically because I always suspected that one day someone might come looking with exactly this kind of motivation. My lawyer, a quiet, meticulous woman named Priya Anand, who I had trusted with select pieces of the full truth from the very beginning of the divorce process, reassured me repeatedly that the structure would hold. "They're looking for evidence you're broke, or careless, or hiding money you shouldn't have," Priya told me during one of our late evening strategy sessions, papers spread across her office table. "They are not looking for evidence that you're the largest shareholder of the very company that pays for their entire lifestyle. Nobody looks for something they can't even imagine exists in the first place." She was right, and the following weeks proved it. Voss's investigator found exactly what I had quietly allowed him to find: a modest personal checking account, some freelance writing income reported honestly on my taxes, informal nonprofit consulting work with no salary attached to any of it. It painted precisely the picture the Whitfields wanted the court to see: a woman adrift, unanchored, professionally undefined, easy to dismiss. Meanwhile, Daniel moved forward with what felt like almost gleeful confidence throughout the entire process. He assumed, correctly, that his family's wealth and legal muscle would simply overwhelm whatever case I might try to build in response. He assumed, incorrectly, and rather fatally for his own position, that I had nothing substantial of my own to stand on. At one deposition, months before the final hearing, he actually smiled, a small, private, satisfied smile, when Voss asked me to describe my current professional occupation for the record, and I answered honestly, without hesitation. "I write. I consult informally for a few organizations. I manage some personal investments." "Personal investments," Voss repeated, almost amused, glancing sideways at Daniel with the faintest hint of shared humor between them. "Can you elaborate on the scale of those investments, Mrs. Bennett, for the record?" "I'd rather not disclose specifics at this time," I said calmly, meeting his eyes without flinching. He smirked and wrote something down in his notes, clearly assuming there was nothing meaningful to disclose, because there was nothing worth disclosing in his mind. He had absolutely no idea that personal investments meant a controlling interest in his own client's family business, the very business paying his considerable legal fees, indirectly, through the family's continued prosperity. I let him believe exactly what he wanted to believe. Every lawyer eventually learns this lesson, whether life teaches it gently or teaches it the hard way. The person who underestimates you has already handed you the advantage, whether they realize it or not. The private investigator Voss hired was a heavy-set man named Frank Doyle, a former police detective who had built a second career out of exactly this kind of work, documenting the lives of women going through divorces with wealthy families, looking for anything that could be used in a courtroom. I never met him directly, but Priya kept careful track of his movements once we confirmed, through routine discovery requests, that he had been retained. For nearly 2 months, Doyle followed a version of my life that looked, from the outside, exactly as unremarkable as I needed it to look. He photographed me picking Emma up from school. He noted the modest sedan I drove, 6 years old, paid off in full. He tracked my visits to a small co-working space downtown, where I kept a desk under a lease registered to my name personally, used for the writing and consulting work everyone already knew about. What he never tracked, because there was nothing to track in the way he was looking, was the quarterly video call I took every 3 months with the two-person compliance team that managed Ash Grove's regulatory filings on my behalf, conducted entirely over an encrypted line from a laptop in my home office, a room Doyle photographed exactly once, from the street, through a curtain I always kept closed. His final report, later entered briefly into the discovery record before the hearing, concluded exactly what the Whitfields wanted to hear. Subject presents no evidence of significant undisclosed assets or unconventional income streams. Lifestyle consistent with reported financial disclosures. Priya read that line to me over the phone the week before the hearing, and I remember laughing for the first time in months, a short, disbelieving laugh that had nothing to do with humor and everything to do with relief. He wasn't wrong, Priya said. He just didn't know what he was looking at. Nobody ever does, I told her, until you decide to show them. While the legal machinery ground forward, life at home continued in its strange, suspended way. Emma was 7 years old enough to sense that something had changed, too young to fully understand why her father now lived in an apartment across town and only saw her every other weekend, carefully scheduled around his business trips. I tried, as much as I could, to keep our home feeling steady for her. We still had pancakes on Saturday mornings. We still read the same worn picture books at bedtime, the ones with cracked spines from years of repeated reading. I never once spoke badly about Daniel in front of her, no matter how much anger I carried into other rooms of the house after she had gone to sleep. My sister Renata became my closest anchor during those months. She lived 20 minutes away, and she showed up constantly, without being asked, the way only a sibling who has known you your entire life can show up. She was the only person, aside from Priya, who knew even a partial version of the Ash Grove story, though even she didn't know the full scale of it. You built something they can't even imagine, Renata told me one night, sitting across from me at my kitchen table, a bottle of wine between us that neither of us had finished. And they're sitting there calling you unstable. Do you know how insane that is? They can't know, I reminded her. Not yet. Not until the right moment. When is the right moment, Claire? Because from where I'm sitting, watching Eleanor smile at charity luncheons while her lawyer tries to take your daughter, the right moment feels like it should have already happened. I understood her frustration. I felt it too, every single day. But I had spent a decade being patient with Ash Grove, watching a distressed asset slowly become something valuable again, trusting a long, quiet process over a quick, satisfying reaction. I wasn't about to abandon that same discipline now, when the stakes involved my own daughter's future, rather than simply a portfolio of shares. The right moment, I told her, is the moment where the truth does the most good, not the moment where it feels the most satisfying to say out loud. Renata didn't fully agree with me that night, but she trusted me enough to wait, and that trust mattered more than I ever properly told her at the time. The cruelest moment came not in a legal filing, but at a family engagement party for Daniel's younger brother, 3 weeks before our final custody hearing. I almost didn't attend. Priya advised against it, worried it would only give Eleanor another opportunity to perform her role in front of an audience. But Emma wanted to see her cousins, and I refused to let this divorce steal every remaining piece of normal childhood she had left, one event at a time. I stood near the edge of the ballroom, holding a glass of sparkling water, watching Emma laugh with her cousins across the room, when Eleanor approached with 2 of her closest friends in tow, women from her charity board, dressed in the kind of quiet, expensive elegance that whispers old money without ever needing to say the words out loud. "Claire, dear," Eleanor said, in that syrupy voice she used whenever she wanted an audience to witness her cruelty dressed up as gentle concern. "I do hope you're preparing for what comes next. It must be so difficult at your age trying to figure out what you'll do with yourself once the settlement is finalized. Some women simply aren't built for careers. There's no shame in that, dear. Not everyone is meant to build something of their own. Her friends laughed softly, politely, the practiced laugh of women who knew exactly what game was being played at that moment, and were more than happy to play along for the entertainment of it. I could have said something right then. I could have told her, standing there in that ballroom, exactly what I had quietly built over the past decade. But I held my glass a little tighter, kept my expression calm, and said only, "You'd be surprised, Eleanor, what some of us manage to build quietly, without needing anyone's permission or approval to do it." She laughed again, waving her hand dismissively, clearly interpreting my words as a bitter, empty boast from a woman with nothing left to lose in the conversation. "Of course, dear," she said, already turning to walk away. "Of course you have." She walked off satisfied, believing she had landed another small, precise cut in a game she assumed only she was playing. She had no idea she had just handed me the exact line I would remember, word for word, when it finally came time to answer her in the one place her money and her name could not protect her: the courtroom, in front of a judge who owed the Whitfield family absolutely nothing. I want to pause the legal story for a moment and tell you about Emma, because in all the noise of depositions and disclosures and ballroom insults, it is easy to forget that a 7-year-old girl was living through all of this too, in her own quieter way. Emma never asked me directly why her father had moved out. Children rarely ask the questions you brace yourself for. Instead, she asked smaller ones. She asked why Grandma Eleanor seemed tired all the time now. She asked why Daddy's new apartment didn't have her favorite cereal. She asked one evening while I was tucking her into bed whether I was going to be okay. "Why do you ask that, sweetheart?" I said, smoothing the blanket over her shoulders. "Grandma said you don't have a job," Emma said, matter of fact, the way children repeat things without understanding the weight adults attach to them. "She said you might have to move somewhere small." I remember sitting very still on the edge of her bed for a moment, choosing my next words as carefully as I would later choose words in front of a judge. "I do have work, Emma," I told her. "It doesn't look like other people's jobs, but I promise you, we are not going anywhere small. We are exactly where we're supposed to be." She studied me for a moment with the particular seriousness only children seem capable of, then nodded and closed her eyes, apparently satisfied. I sat there a while longer after she fell asleep, thinking about how casually cruelty travels through a family, passed from an adult's mouth into a child's understanding of the world, without the adult ever considering what it costs the child to carry it. That night, more than any deposition or courtroom filing, hardened my resolve. Whatever else happened in that courtroom, I was determined that Emma would grow up understanding that her mother's worth was never something anyone else got to define for her. The night before the final hearing, I sat alone in my study long after Emma had gone to sleep, reviewing the disclosure documents Priya and I had prepared and submitted under seal 2 weeks earlier, exactly as required by law for asset division cases involving private corporate holdings. I thought about the version of myself who had first opened an account for Ashgrove Capital Partners 11 years earlier, young and uncertain, betting a modest inheritance on a company in crisis because I believed, quietly and stubbornly, that I understood something the people panicking around me could not yet see. I thought about every quarter I had spent managing that investment in silence, never once seeking credit, never once telling Daniel, never once imagining it would one day become the very thing standing between my daughter and a courtroom decision that could have separated us. Priya called that evening, her voice steady over the phone. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" "I've been ready for 11 years, I told her. "I just didn't know it yet." "Voss has no idea what's in that folder," she said. "None of them do. Tomorrow, that changes." I didn't sleep much that night. Not from fear, but from the strange, quiet weight of finally standing at the edge of something I had carried privately for so long. Tomorrow, the silence would end, one way or another, and I would find out whether patience truly had been the right choice all along. The custody and asset hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in early spring. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, wood-paneled, quiet, the kind of room that makes every word feel heavier than it would anywhere else in the world. Presiding was Judge Miriam Castellano, a woman known throughout the legal community for two things above all others: an almost impossible level of preparation before every hearing, and zero tolerance for lawyers who tried to posture instead of arguing plain facts. Priya had told me, with something close to genuine relief in her voice, if there's any judge in this city who won't be moved by the Whitfield name, it's her. Voss opened strong, exactly as I expected him to. He painted a picture of Daniel as a stable, high-earning executive, deeply embedded in a respected family business, capable of providing Emma with security, education, and a lifelong financial safety net that no ordinary household could match. Then he turned his attention fully toward me. Your Honor, in contrast, Mrs. Bennet has no verifiable stable income, no defined career, and by her own admission during deposition, describes her occupation only as writing and informal consulting. We are not questioning her love for her daughter. We are questioning whether an unstable financial and professional life is the appropriate environment for a child of this family's standing. He gestured toward Eleanor, seated in the front row, who nodded solemnly, tissue in hand, playing her role with the same practiced precision she had brought to every family gathering for years. The Whitfield family, Voss continued, his voice rising slightly for emphasis, has built something significant over 3 generations. We simply ask the court to consider what environment truly serves this child's best interests, one of established stability or one of undefined uncertainty. Judge Castellano listened without expression, making steady notes on the paper in front of her. Then she turned her attention to me and my counsel. Mrs. Bennet, your attorney has requested time to address the court directly regarding your financial standing, given the nature of the claims made this morning. I'll allow it. Priya stood beside me, straightening a folder on the table. This was the moment we had prepared for, carefully and patiently, for months. Thank you, Your Honor, Priya said, her voice calm and clear. Before we proceed further, I'd like to formally enter into the court record a set of financial disclosures that were submitted under seal 2 weeks ago, per standard procedure for asset division proceedings involving private corporate holdings. I believe opposing counsel has not yet had the opportunity to review them in full, as they were only unsealed for full court review this morning. Voss's expression shifted immediately, the first visible crack of confusion I had seen from him in months of proceedings. Your Honor, we were informed these were standard financial disclosures. Nothing in the summary was flagged as unusual. They are standard disclosures, Judge Castellano said evenly, glancing down at a folder in front of her that I recognized immediately. The paperwork Priya and I had submitted weeks earlier, exactly as required by law, listing every asset I held under every entity I controlled, including Ashgrove Capital Partners in full detail. Mr. Voss, the judge continued, I'll ask that you review page 14 of the disclosure now, specifically the beneficial ownership section. I watched him find the page. I watched his eyes move across it once, then a second time, more slowly, as if the words might somehow rearrange themselves into something less impossible than what he was reading. He looked up toward Eleanor. Eleanor looked back at him, confused, not yet understanding what he had just read on that single page. Judge Castellano did not wait for Voss to fully compose himself before continuing. She addressed the entire room directly, her voice calm, measured, entirely without theatrical drama, which somehow made the moment land even harder than shouting ever could have. For the record, she said, the court has reviewed sealed financial disclosures submitted by Mrs. Bennet's counsel, verified independently through corporate registry records and third-party audit, as required in asset division cases involving private holding structures of this nature. She paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough for every single person in that room to lean forward slightly in their seats. These disclosures confirm that Mrs. Claire Bennet is the controlling majority shareholder of Ashgrove Capital Partners, an entity which, over the past decade, acquired a controlling interest in Whitfield Holdings LLC, the parent holding company of Whitfield Industries. The room went completely silent, the kind of silence that seems to press against your ears. I watched Eleanor's face change in real time. Confusion first, then disbelief, then something close to genuine horror, as the full meaning of those words settled slowly over her. To clarify for the court and for the full record, Judge Castellano continued, Mrs. Bennett holds a 51% controlling stake in the very holding company that owns the business currently employing Mr. Bennett, and which has, for 3 generations, been the primary source of the Whitfield family's wealth and stability. The same stability repeatedly referenced by opposing counsel throughout this morning's proceedings. Voss stood frozen at his table, his mouth slightly open, the folder still held loosely in his hands. Daniel, seated beside him, had gone completely pale, his eyes fixed somewhere on the table in front of him. In simple terms, the judge said, turning slightly toward Voss, the party your client's counsel has spent this hearing describing as financially unstable and professionally undefined is, in fact, the majority owner of the company your client's family has spent 3 generations building. I would ask counsel to reconsider his characterization of Mrs. Bennett's, as stated plainly in his opening remarks. Undefined uncertainty. Voss said nothing. There was simply nothing left to say in response. Eleanor's tissue sat forgotten in her lap. She stared at me across the courtroom, and for the first time in 11 years of knowing her, I watched every ounce of her carefully maintained composure disappear at once, all in a single, silent moment. I did not smile. I did not gloat, even quietly to myself. I simply looked back at her, calm, steady, and said nothing at all, because the judge had already said everything that needed saying on my behalf, in front of everyone who had ever doubted me. Judge Castellano allowed a short recess after that revelation, giving both legal teams time to regroup and reconsider their positions. In the hallway outside, I sat quietly on a bench while Priya reviewed her notes beside me, already anticipating what would come next. Emma was still with my sister, unaware of what had just happened inside that courtroom, and I was grateful for that small mercy. Whatever else this day became, I never wanted her present for the moment her father's family finally learned the full truth. Through the frosted glass of the courtroom door, I could hear raised voices, Voss and Daniel, arguing in hushed, urgent tones just beyond the threshold. I couldn't make out every word clearly, but I heard enough to understand the shape of it. Voss was furious, not at me, but at his own legal team, for failing to properly investigate the very disclosures they were legally required to review in advance of the hearing. Daniel's voice, for the first time in this entire drawn-out process, sounded genuinely shaken rather than confidently dismissive. Eleanor did not come out into the hallway during the recess. She stayed inside, alone, in the front row, staring straight ahead at nothing in particular. When the hearing resumed, the tone in that courtroom had completely changed. Voss no longer spoke about my instability. He no longer mentioned careers or income or what environment was appropriate for a child carrying the Whitfield name. Instead, he quietly requested a private conference with the judge and opposing counsel. Legal language, essentially, for we need to renegotiate everything, immediately, before this gets any worse for our client. Judge Castellano granted the request, but not before making one final statement for the record that I will remember for the rest of my life, word for word. I want to note something for this court, she said, looking directly at Voss, and by clear extension, at Eleanor seated behind him. This hearing opened with an argument that a parent's worth to a child could be measured by title, income bracket, or how visible their success appeared to the outside world. I would remind counsel, and everyone present in this room today, that ownership, stability, and character are not always visible on the surface of a person's life. Sometimes the person a family dismisses as having nothing is quietly holding everything together, whether that family realizes it or not. She closed the folder in front of her with a quiet, final motion. We'll proceed to private conference. I learned much of what happened inside that private conference room later, in pieces, from Priya, who had been present for all 3 hours of it. She told me the story with a kind of restrained satisfaction that suggested it had taken real effort not to smile while it was happening. Voss, she said, had spent the first 30 minutes trying to argue that the disclosure was somehow irrelevant to the custody portion of the case, that ownership of shares had nothing to do with parental fitness. Judge Castellano, according to Priya, listened to exactly 2 minutes of that argument before cutting him off. "Mr. Voss," she reportedly said, "your entire opening argument this morning was built on the premise that Mrs. Bennet lacked financial stability. You cannot now argue that her financial standing is irrelevant, simply because it turned out to favor her rather than your client. You opened this door. I'm not going to pretend it doesn't exist, because you no longer like what's on the other side of it." Daniel, for his part, had said very little during the entire conference, according to Priya. At one point, when Voss suggested requesting a delay to properly reassess the family's position, Daniel reportedly said, quietly, almost to himself, "There's no reassessing this. She's owned it for years. We just never knew." Eleanor was not present for the private conference. Family members typically aren't. But she waited outside the entire time, alone, in a hallway chair, according to a court clerk who later mentioned it to Priya in passing. Nobody sat with her. Nobody from her own legal team thought to check on her. For a woman who had spent decades surrounded by people eager for her attention, that image stayed with me longer than almost anything else that happened that day. The private conference that followed lasted nearly 3 hours, though almost none of it involved me directly. Priya emerged periodically to update me on the shifting terms, each version noticeably more reasonable than the one before it. By the end of that afternoon, the custody arrangement Voss and Eleanor had fought so aggressively to tilt entirely in Daniel's favor had been resolved almost overnight. Emma would live primarily with me, with reasonable scheduled visitation for Daniel, not because of anything directly related to Ashgrove or the shares I held, but simply because, once the manufactured narrative of my instability collapsed under its own weight, the actual, ordinary facts of our daily lives finally spoke clearly for themselves. I had been Emma's primary caregiver for years. That had never once changed, at any point during the marriage. It had simply been buried under a mountain of manufactured doubt, carefully built and carefully maintained by people who assumed no one would ever look closely enough to question it. The asset division took longer to finalize, largely because Voss now had to explain to the Whitfield family board exactly what had happened, and why a former daughter-in-law now held a controlling interest in shares that governed the entire company's future decisions. That conversation, I later learned from Priya, did not go smoothly for him. I want to be clear about something important here, because I think it matters more than the drama of the reveal itself. I had no interest in punishing Whitfield Industries, or its employees, or the thousands of ordinary workers whose jobs depended on that company continuing to run well. My ownership through Ashgrove had never been about revenge, even in that courtroom, even after everything Eleanor had said to me over the years. It had always simply been about recognizing value where others saw only risk, and having the patience to hold on to that recognition quietly until it mattered. 3 weeks after the hearing, I received a formal letter from the board of Whitfield Industries requesting a meeting. I almost declined. I had never wanted to run the company, and I worried that appearing in person might look like exactly the kind of power move Eleanor would have expected from someone in my position. But Priya encouraged me to attend, at least once, if only to set expectations clearly from the very beginning. The boardroom was exactly the kind of room I expected. Dark wood, tall windows overlooking the old factory district the company had grown out of generations earlier, portraits of long-dead Whitfield men lining the walls like a silent jury. I sat at the far end of a long table, across from board members who had, until 3 weeks earlier, had no idea I existed as anything more than Daniel's wife. The chairman, an older man named Robert Ainsley, who had served on the board for over 20 years, opened the meeting carefully. "Mrs. Bennet, I think I speak for the board when I say this situation has been unexpected. We'd like to understand your intentions going forward." I had prepared for this question for weeks. "My intentions," I told him, are exactly what they've always been for the past decade. I have no interest in operating this company. I have every interest in it continuing to succeed, employing the people who depend on it, and being managed by people who understand manufacturing far better than I ever will. I bought into Whitfield Holdings because I believed in what this company could become again. Nothing about that belief has changed simply because my name is now attached to it publicly. Ainsley studied me for a long moment. Most people in your position, having endured what you've endured with this family, might feel differently. Most people, I said, haven't spent a decade learning that patience creates more value than anger ever could. I'm not interested in punishing a company for the behavior of a few people within the family that founded it. I'm interested in it continuing to do well, the same as I've been interested in that outcome for the past 10 years. There was a long silence after that. Then Ainsley nodded slowly, and I watched something shift in the room. Not quite warmth, but a kind of professional respect that had nothing to do with family history and everything to do with the plain, steady logic of what I had just said. "Then I think," he said, "we understand each other, Mrs. Bennet." I left that boardroom knowing I had never wanted to be the story. I had simply wanted to be underestimated for as long as it served me, and then, when the moment finally required it, to be understood clearly, on my own terms, for exactly what I had built. Word moved quickly through the family once the hearing concluded, even though neither side wanted the story to spread publicly beyond the people directly involved. Daniel's younger brother called me 2 days later, his voice careful, almost apologetic, though he never quite managed to say the word directly. "I didn't know any of this," he said. "None of us did. She's not handling it well." "I imagine not," I said, and left it at that. Eleanor herself never called. Weeks passed before I saw her again, at a school event for Emma that neither of us could reasonably avoid attending. She looked smaller somehow, standing near the entrance of the auditorium, no longer surrounded by the same confident circle of charity board friends who had laughed so easily beside her in that ballroom months earlier. She approached me carefully, almost hesitantly, a version of herself I had genuinely never seen before in 11 years of knowing her. "Claire," she said quietly, "I owe you an apology, I think. I said things I shouldn't have said." I looked at her for a long moment before responding. Not out of cruelty, but because I wanted to choose my words as carefully as she was, apparently trying to choose hers. "You spent years telling me I had built nothing," I said finally. "I'm not looking for an apology, Eleanor. I'm looking for you to understand that the next time you decide someone has nothing worth respecting, you might want to actually check first." She nodded slowly, and for once, she didn't try to have the last word. She simply walked toward her seat in the auditorium, and I walked toward mine, and Emma performed in her school recital that evening, completely unaware of the quiet reckoning happening in the rows behind her. Daniel reached out to me once, several weeks after the hearing concluded, in a message that read simply, "I didn't know. I'm sorry. I didn't respond right away." I let the message sit for 2 full days, thinking carefully about whether a response was even necessary, or whether silence might say everything I needed it to say on its own. When I finally did write back, I kept it brief. "You didn't know because you never once asked what I actually did with my time. You assumed silence meant emptiness. It never did." He never wrote back after that, and I never expected him to. Some conversations end not with resolution, but simply with the quiet recognition that nothing more needs to be said. In the months that followed, our co-parenting arrangement settled into something workable, if not entirely warm. Daniel showed up for Emma's scheduled visitation, mostly on time, mostly present in the way a father should be. Whatever else had broken between us, I never wanted Emma to carry the weight of her parents' failures as her own, and to his credit, Daniel seemed to understand that much, even if he understood little else about the years that had led us here. A year passed before I felt ready to think about that hearing, without my chest tightening at the memory of it. In that year, a great deal changed, quietly, the way most real change happens. Emma turned 8, then nearly 9, thriving in a school she loved, seemingly unaware of how close she had once come to being pulled away from the only steady home she had ever known. Daniel and I settled into a co-parenting rhythm that, while never warm, became at least reliably functional. He came to her school plays. He remembered her birthday without needing a reminder. I decided, eventually, that this was enough to ask of him, even if it wasn't everything. Eleanor and I never became close, and I never expected we would. But something between us shifted permanently after that hearing. She stopped commenting on my career because there was nothing left to say on the subject that wouldn't sound foolish in hindsight. At a family gathering the following winter, I watched her introduce me to a new acquaintance not as Daniel's ex-wife, the way she once might have, but simply as Emma's mother, Claire. No qualifiers, no faint condescension buried in her tone. It wasn't an apology, but it was, in its own quiet way, a kind of respect I had never expected to receive from her. Ashgrove Capital Partners continued exactly as it always had, quietly, patiently, without fanfare. I still didn't run Whitfield Industries day to day. I never wanted to, and the professional management team the board eventually hired was more than capable of the job. But every year, at the shareholders' meeting, I sat quietly in the room, one name among many on the ownership ledger, watching a company I had once rescued from collapse continue to provide stability for thousands of families who had no idea how close it had once come to disappearing entirely. I never told Emma the full story until she was older, old enough to understand not just the facts of it, but the deeper lesson underneath the facts. When I finally did, sitting with her on the porch one summer evening years later, she asked me the question I had been waiting for her to ask. "Why didn't you just tell everyone from the beginning, Mom? Why did you let them think you had nothing?" I thought about it for a long moment before answering. Because some truths only matter when they're heard at the right time, by the right people, in the right way, I told her. If I had told your grandmother the truth at a dinner table out of anger, it would have just been another argument. But when the judge said it, in that courtroom, with the evidence right there in front of everyone, that was the truth finally being allowed to do its work properly. Emma nodded slowly, the same serious nod she'd given me as a 7-year-old on the night she asked if we were going to be okay. "We were always going to be okay," she said, more to herself than to me. "Yes," I told her. "We were." There is one more piece of this story I've never told anyone outside my closest circle, not even Renata in full detail. About 6 months after the hearing, I sat down one evening and wrote a letter to Eleanor. I never sent it. I'm not entirely sure why I wrote it at all, except that some part of me needed to put the full weight of those years into words, even if no one else would ever read them. I wrote about the first Christmas after Daniel and I married, when Eleanor had quietly rearranged the seating chart so that I sat at the far end of the table, near the kitchen door, while newer, more socially prominent guests sat closer to the family's center. I wrote about the years of small comments, delivered so gently they were almost impossible to argue with directly. Comments about my clothes, my modest car, my choice to leave a law firm that, in Eleanor's words, so many young women would have killed to stay at. I wrote about the night Emma came home from a birthday party at her cousin's house and asked me, in the innocent way children ask devastating questions, "Why does Grandma always talk about Daddy's job like it's the only real job in the family?" I wrote, finally, about the ballroom conversation, the one where Eleanor told me, in front of her friends, that not everyone is meant to build something. I told her, in that letter, that I had spent 11 years being underestimated by a family that measured worth only in the currency it understood, and that the day the judge read page 14 of my disclosure aloud in that courtroom was not a moment of revenge for me. It was simply the first time in over a decade that the truth had been allowed to exist in the same room as the Whitfield name, without needing to apologize for itself. I never sent that letter. I folded it, sealed it in an envelope, and placed it in a drawer in my study, where it remains to this day. Some words are more important to write than to send. Writing it helped me let go of something I had been carrying silently for years, long before that courtroom ever gave me the chance to set it down properly, in front of witnesses who finally understood exactly what they had been dismissing all along. I think about that hearing often, not the moment the judge revealed the truth, though that moment will stay with me for the rest of my life, but the moment before it. The moment where I sat quietly, letting Eleanor believe I had nothing, letting Voss believe there was nothing worth finding, letting an entire room full of confident, well-dressed people underestimate me completely, without ever once trying to correct them. For years, I let people believe my life was smaller than it actually was, because I understood something early on that most people never learn until life forces the lesson upon them directly. Quiet doesn't mean empty. Patience doesn't mean weakness. And the person a room dismisses as having nothing may, in fact, be the only one quietly holding the whole thing together, without anyone ever thinking to ask how. I didn't build Ashgrove Capital Partners for revenge. I built it because I saw an opportunity, years before anyone believed I was capable of understanding one, and I quietly, carefully followed it through to its conclusion. The fact that it eventually became the very thing that protected my daughter and exposed the cruelty hiding underneath a family's polished public reputation was never something I planned from the beginning. It was simply what happens when patience meets timing, and the truth is finally allowed into a room that has spent too long ignoring it. I've thought many times about what would have happened if I had chosen differently. If I had exposed Ashgrove years earlier, at that first dinner table where Eleanor made her comment about carrying the family legacy, or in that ballroom, in front of her friends, the moment she smiled and said, "Not everyone is meant to build something." It would have felt satisfying in the moment, the way small victories always feel satisfying before you understand their true cost. But it would have changed nothing structurally. It would have simply been one more argument at one more family gathering, easily dismissed, easily reframed by people with far more social power than I had at the time. The courtroom mattered because it was the one place where evidence outweighed reputation, where a judge's careful reading of page 14 carried more weight than decades of a family's practiced charm. That is, I think, the deeper lesson underneath this entire story. It is not simply about hidden wealth, or a dramatic reveal, or even about Eleanor's cruelty finally catching up with her. It is about understanding that the right platform for truth matters as much as the truth itself. Speaking too early, out of anger, in the wrong room, to the wrong audience, can waste even the most powerful truth you carry. Waiting, however difficult it feels in the moment, can turn that same truth into something undeniable. To anyone listening to this who has ever sat quietly while someone measured your worth by a title, an income bracket, or how visible your success appeared to the outside world, I want you to remember something important. Not everyone who looks like they have nothing is truly empty. Some of us are simply waiting for the right moment, in the right room, to let the truth finally speak for itself. And when that moment finally comes, you don't need to raise your voice. Sometimes all you need to do is sit quietly and let the judge read page 14.